A few years ago, I went on a Hawaii cruise with a few friends. It started out as a great little vacation. However, by the third day at sea, things started getting weird. After 2 days of eating constant sushi, I started to feel a little dizzy and lightheaded at times. My friends told me no more sushi, as it probably had something to do with that. But anyway, after a few drinks, I separated myself from my friends, who were sitting in one of the ship's many bars, and started walking back to my room because I really wasn't feeling too well. I took some weird lower deck route back in the direction of my room since some of the bars were on the lowest public levels of the ship. I asked one of the maids in the hallway which way was the quickest to get to the section my room was in. The maid had a very thick accent, but I understood her to have said, "Keep going straight, then make a left at the sign." So I did that. I came to a sign. I don't remember what it said, but it was a sign, so I turned left there. I was in some narrow hall with a tiled floor instead of carpeting. It didn't seem like the right way to go at all. It seemed more like an employee-only section. Still, I figured I'd give it a chance before turning back and continued down this narrow hall. I came to a corner, then looked to my right, and here was the creepiest hallway you could possibly find on the ship. Half the lights were out, one was flashing on and off, but at the end of this tiny hallway was someone standing, facing the wall. My head started to hurt even more as I saw this. I had to rub my eyes to make sure what I was seeing was real. When I moved my hands away from my eyes, the person standing by the wall was now looking at me. Considering they were standing in the dark section of this hallway, not lit up by lights, I couldn't really see much about their actual face other than that I knew they were looking at me. I turned and went back the direction I came. I walked back down the hall. The maid was gone now. However, with my head still killing me, I managed to get back to the lobby of this floor, and at that point, finding the elevators was easy. I made it back to my room easily at that point and crashed into bed. I was sure I had gotten food poisoning from the sushi because my stomach was also hurting along with my head. Anyway, I woke up at some odd hour in the night and I couldn't move. The only thing I could move were my eyes. I tried looking around the room, but my inability to move my head or sit in an upright position made seeing a lot of the room difficult. I remember something seemed to appear in my peripheral vision. I turned my eyes to the opposite side of the room, and there was a figure facing the wall. As I looked at it, I wanted to scream or run, but I couldn't do anything. It was as real as could be. I knew I was seeing it. The head of the figure turned around to face me, but all I saw was black. The body, the face, everything about this figure just looked black. The figure started to move closer to me. The most disturbing thing about it, though, was that as it moved towards me, it didn't move its limbs. It seemed to just slowly float towards me. The figure stopped over my bed. Now I could slightly see a face to it, and I recognized it as that person I saw earlier in the night in that hallway. I don't remember exactly how long that figure stood over my bed, but suddenly I saw its mouth open twice as wide as you'd expect to be humanly possible. Out came a deafeningly real scream, so loud that I think it woke me up completely from the sleep paralysis I was just in. The craziest thing I remember was the scream of this sleep paralysis figure feeding into the scream of my own voice. I was finally able to make a sound. I flicked on the light, and my friend who was in the other bed woke up asking what was wrong. I told him about the horrible experience I just had. He once again said I'd been eating way too much raw fish and it was messing with my head. My whole body was shaking, and my voice was trembling. I went back to sleep and don't remember having another dream that night. But I still wonder if that person I saw in the hallway was real or not, because I'm 90% sure that's the hallucination I had in my paralysis. That hallucination was also the realest, most horrific thing I'd ever seen. When I was 14 years old, my family and I went on a boating trip out of Melbourne's western Port Bay. I remember being at the helm with my father, steering the little boat over the waves, and then the next thing we knew, my big brother was shouting that water was coming and happened so fast. Mom and Dad were shouting for us to stay together, and then suddenly, the boat tipped over, and we were in the water. We later found out that the bottom of our boat had been almost completely rotten and that its owners had been extremely and willfully negligent in renting it to us. We had no choice but to start swimming. Since it was late in the evening, no one had seen us go down, so it was up to us to rescue ourselves. I was a reasonably good swimmer, and we all had life jackets on, but it was still around 2 miles back to shore. Land looked like it was a long, long way away. Darkness fell as we were swimming, but my dad started to struggle, and my big brother swam back to try and help him. My mom and I stuck together and kept going, but we soon lost sight of my father and brother. Seagulls cried out above me, and I kept imagining that they were warning me of an attack from sharks that were no doubt swimming in the waters around us. I could see land, but it didn't seem to get any closer. Finally, after more than 3 hours in that water, I felt the sandy bottom against my feet. I'd reached the mud flats of what I believed was the mainland, but my mom, dad, and brother were nowhere to be seen. I was weak, cold, and exhausted. I dragged myself through the mud, which at some points was almost up to my waist, and this was even more terrifying than the swimming. The mud kept on sucking me down, and I was terrified that I'd sink and be suffocated. My muscles ached, my lungs burned, and I felt like I was about to pass out at points, but at the same time, I knew the clock was ticking, that it was essentially down to me and me alone to get help from my family. The clock was ticking in my head, and I needed to get my family the help they badly needed. When I finally made it ashore, I realized that I was on French Island, an island with an old disused prison on it that has only about 40 people on it. I ran through the bushland, using up the last reserves of my energy, it felt like, and feeling thorns scratching against my legs and arms. I ran for a long time too, stopping every so often to catch my breath before continuing through the bush. Finally, I found a house, and after banging on the door, someone opened it, and I told them what had happened. I just remember crying and crying as they tried to comfort me and how I begged them to help find my family. They told me everything was going to be okay and that they'd contacted the Victoria Coast Guard. I appreciate that they were just trying to console me, but I knew they were wrong. The next morning, the bodies of my mom, dad, and older brother were recovered from the water off the coast of Fairhaven. Words can't express how devastated I was, and I was filled with this overwhelming survivor guilt, thinking that I should be the one dead. For 5 long years, I was a wreck, and I think I might be dead from drink and drugs if it wasn't for the birth of my first kid. For a long, long time, I avoided any kind of large body of water, which included swimming pools, before my therapist suggested that I undertake some exposure therapy. This would involve brief trips to a local pool, but at first, my anxiety was so bad that even if my head was above the water, I just couldn't breathe. I tried for 4 months, but nothing worked until a local swim coach heard my story and offered some help. Over the next year or so, the therapy started to chip away at my fear until finally, I was able to look at the sea without feeling like I was about to have a panic attack. My proudest moment has been taking part in a charity swim across the Rip, which is an infamously rough stretch of water. We helped raise money for a domestic violence charity here in Australia, which is a cause very close to my heart for reasons that could well make for another true scary story. It might have taken me 20 years, but I no longer let my fear control me. I now understand that what happened wasn't my fault, but the irony of needing water to heal the very trauma that it created has never been lost on me. I live on the East Coast of the United States. Recently, I moved to Florida from Georgia and figured it would take a couple of days to sail my boat down there to our new waterfront house. I didn't have any cars with a tow hitch to carry the boat, let alone a trailer to carry it with, so sailing it seemed like the best option. While my wife finished up moving the rest of the stuff to our new house, I kissed my family goodbye and set sail. None of them were really willing to come with me on this adventure, and I didn't blame them. But anyway, I brought enough food and gas to last me the whole trip. The first day was a breeze. I got some sleep, then sailed for 10 hours the next day, with breaks in between, of course. By nightfall, I went to bed in the cabin. Sleeping in a rocking boat isn't exactly the easiest thing to do, so I was up for hours rolling around on my sides, trying to find a comfortable position, trying to press my head firmly enough into the pillow, thinking it would hide the unbearable feeling of the boat rocking over the ocean surface. Eventually, I heard sounds coming from above my head that I could best describe as small thumps, and it sounded like someone walking on my boat. I couldn't tell yet. With a medium-sized fishing boat floating out in the ocean, random sounds like creaks and thumps are going to be made, but these thumps were coming so rapidly and consistently. I started to get sick with the thought that someone out this far could be on my boat. I had to get out and look, but I wanted to be quiet. So, I opened the cabin door very slowly. But before I could even open it all the way, I heard a big splash in the water. It sounded to me like someone or something jumped into the water. I was honestly scared I wasn't alone, even though it made no sense to me. I didn't want to go outside. I felt I should move the boat away from whoever or whatever was out there in the water. So, I ran outside to the cockpit and started the boat engine. I gave the boat some gas and got myself the hell away from there immediately. I heard my boat bump into something in the water. Not something heavy enough to cause any kind of impact, but heavy enough to hear it and slightly feel the boat bump. I didn't see what it was because, to be honest, I wasn't paying attention to whatever was out in the water. Plus, the lights weren't on anyway. I sailed for a few hours in the deep night because I was wide awake anyway. When I started to get tired, I killed the motor and went back to bed. Emphasis on the word bed, not sleep, because even though I felt tired, I was still having trouble falling asleep. I figure half an hour passed, and I started hearing more thumps. This time, the thumps seemed louder and more clear for some reason. In a split second, my heart started racing again. The thumps were consistent and deliberate sounding. Again, no way it was just boat noises. I felt like I was being followed by someone. I couldn't just sit there and hide in the cabin like this all night. I had to sum up the courage to go outside again. But when I checked, there was no one on the entire boat. Was it my imagination? Were these sounds really just coming from the boat? I decided that must have been the case and once again went back inside the cabin to bed. I lay there extremely silent now, trying to listen for any little noise. When I did this, I heard something. I knew I did. It wasn't the sound of thumping or anything like that. I had to perk up my ears to really pay attention. I figured out what I was hearing. It wasn't the sound of the wind outside or the water hitting the boat. It was the sound of someone breathing. It was not the sound of my breathing, but someone else's. It was coming from inside the cabin. Of course, I panicked, but I tried to maintain composure so as not to make it obvious. I got out from the bed, walked outside the cabin, and locked myself in the cockpit. I intended on sailing until I could find a dock by the shore. There's a small window that looks into the cockpit from the cabin. It has a curtain. I turn to it every minute or so, at least once, to look back at it, expecting to see someone watching me. One of the times I looked back, I did see someone. The curtain was curved up a little bit in the corner, and I saw someone's eye and maybe a quarter of their face peeking into the cockpit. I turned away right away, acting like I didn't see them. I had the thought, what if it was my young son trying to scare me? But it wouldn't make sense. I saw him waving goodbye when I set sail from the house. It was 3 or 4 tense hours of hell, thinking at any moment someone could break into the cockpit and stab me. But I made it to shore and sailed through the narrow canal. I had already called the cops 15 minutes earlier, requesting they have a few officers waiting at the dock I was headed to. It was still dark out, but I saw people standing on the dock, and I couldn't have been more excited to get there. When I stopped the boat next to the dock, I came out from the cockpit, screaming at the officers to help, pointing at the cabin door. The 2 officers went into the cabin with their hands on their pistols. 10 seconds later, I heard them yelling at someone. They pulled out some guy with really long gray wet hair and a similar beard, wearing wet skinny ripped jeans and a gray t-shirt. They had him in cuffs. As they walked him past me, he looked at me and just laughed this insanely off-putting laugh. The guy looked and sounded like a meth head, the best way I could describe him. The police questioned him, but he never answered anything as to how or when he got on my boat or what he was trying to do. But thinking back, when I heard breathing in my cabin, it's likely he was hiding under my bed, and that's the most horrifying thought imaginable. By then, I was exhausted and went back to my cabin and fell asleep right away. By late morning, I made it to the new house, and my nightmarish adventure was over. On May 19 of 1884, a yacht known as the Mignonette departed the English port of Southampton bound for the coast of eastern Australia. Constructed in 1867, the 52-ton cruiser had been purchased by an Australian lawyer named Jack W., who sought a suitable crew to transport her to Sydney. But it was no small feat. Many experienced sailors noted that the yacht was an inshore boat unsuited to long voyages in open waters. And what's more, even the most experienced sailors were intimidated by the 15,000-mile journey, with many turning the job offer down before a full crew was finally assembled. In the end, a 4-man team was put together, which consisted of Captain Tom Dudley, Edwin Stevens, Edmund Brooks, and a 17-year-old cabin boy by the name of Richard Parker. Almost 2 months into their journey, the crew of the Mignonette found themselves sailing into a gale around 1,600 miles northwest of South Africa's Cape of Good Hope. Despite the fierce winds, their journey was progressing steadily. Then, in order to enjoy a good night's sleep, Captain Dudley gave the order to heave to. In sailing, heaving to is a way of slowing a vessel's forward progress, as well as fixing the helm and sail position so that the vessel does not have to be steered, is commonly used as a way for sailors to take a break or to wait out strong or contrary winds. However, just as the maneuver was completed and young Richard Parker was sent below to prepare tea, a freak wave struck the Mignonette, damaging a bulkhead and causing vast amounts of seawater to flood into her hold. Realizing the yacht was doomed, Captain Dudley ordered his 3 crew members to man their single 13-foot lifeboat. The lifeboat was of flimsy construction, with its boards only a quarter-inch thick, but as the Mignonette began to list and groan, it proved the crew's only source of salvation. Just minutes later, the crew watched as the Mignonette disappeared below the waves, having managed to salvage nothing but a few pieces of navigational equipment and 2 tins of turnips. At first, Captain Dudley managed to stabilize the lifeboat by constructing an improvised sea anchor, a device reminiscent of a kind of waterborne parachute. It dragged behind the lifeboat, slowing its progress slightly and allowing for more effective manual steering. The captain also determined that they must have been around 700 miles from the nearest dry land, meaning that they were unlikely to be rescued anytime soon. During their first night at sea, the crew was forced to fight off a great white shark using nothing but their oars. The next morning, they were able to catch a sea turtle by simply dragging it out of the water. This yielded about 3 pounds of meat each, plus the bones, which, along with the tins of turnips, lasted until July 17th. The sailors planned on drinking the turtle blood to stave off fatal dehydration, but after it became contaminated with seawater, they began imbibing their own urine. By July 20th, the teenage cabin boy Richard Parker had become so sick of drinking his own urine that he began slurping up handfuls of seawater. This only exacerbated his dangerous levels of dehydration, and he fell unconscious shortly afterward. Around the same time that young Parker began to drift into unconsciousness, Dudley, Stevens, and Brooks began discussing the prospect of cannibalism. On July 24th, Dudley told the others that it was better for one of them to die so that the others would survive and suggested they should draw lots. Brooks refused, but that night, Dudley once again raised the matter and pointed out that while the childless cabin boy was most probably dying, he and Stevens had wives and families to take care of. The boy would be mourned, but unlike their women and children, his parents would not starve without his wages. This appeared to have been the most effective method of argument, as the next morning, Captain Dudley and Edwin Stevens made the decision to kill Richard Parker, ensuring his blood was fresh enough to drink. Brooks, who had refused to take part in the earlier discussion, claimed he neither agreed nor disagreed with the decision. Captain Dudley then said a prayer, and with Stevens holding the boy still in the event that he woke up, the captain pushed his penknife into Parker's jugular vein and ended his life. Once Parker's heart had ceased to beat, the 3 surviving sailors began butchering his body. Ironically, and despite his early reticence, it was reported that Edmund Brooks was ravenous in his consumption of Parker's flesh, while Edwin Stevens appeared to have a change of heart and ate very little. Speaking of the scene that followed, Captain Dudley later said, "I can assure you I shall never forget the sight of my 2 unfortunate companions over that ghastly meal. We were like mad wolves who should get the most, and for men, fathers of children, to commit such a deed, we could not have our right reason." Just a few days later, the survivors were still feasting on Parker's remains when they spotted the sail of a passing ship named the Monuma and successfully garnered its attention. Finally, on September 6, 1884, the Monuma sailed into Falmouth Harbor, where the 3 survivors of the Minette reported to a customs officer by the name of Mr. Cheeseman. Initially, the men were greeted with great relief, as it was assumed the Minette's crew had been lost when it failed to reach its Cape Town checkpoint. Yet, after explaining the grisly methods by which they had survived, the situation took a dramatic turn. Incredibly, the surviving crew members were remarkably candid regarding the retelling of the events and openly admitted to having murdered young Richard Parker before consuming his still warm flesh. Contemporary defense attorneys, who tend to limit their clients' vocabulary to the words "no" and "comment," would consider such a frank admission to be nothing short of madness. But although Captain Dudley and his 2 surviving crew members felt deep shame and guilt, they were comfortable in their confession because, in doing so, they invoked what was known as the custom of the sea. Since the very first days of humanity's oceanic exploration, accidents and misfortune has humbled even the hardiest of vessels, and those who survived their sinking ships either cast adrift or washed up on some far-flung shore were often faced with what was referred to as the delicate question, to eat or not to eat their dead or dying shipmates. Thankfully, only a very small number of seamen and explorers have been faced with such a grim situation. But with 19th century British culture being so centered around its maritime industries, such incidents became embedded into the public consciousness. For example, in the early 1600s, 7 English sailors were cruising through the Caribbean when they were blown out to sea and cast adrift for 17 days. When they reached the point of starvation, the sailors drew straws to decide who would sacrifice their flesh for the good of the collective. Ironically, the man chosen was the one who suggested the idea in the first place. According to his shipmates, he nobly consented and was swiftly put to death. The sailors survived on the man's flesh until they reached the Isle of St. Martin, and following repatriation to British territory, they were put on trial for murder. However, on the day of their hearing, the colonial judge showed a great deal of sympathy towards them, which, in turn, reflected the views of the wider public. The sailors were pardoned, with the judge stating their actions were of inevitable necessity. More than 200 years later, consuming one's dead shipmates in order to survive periods of deprivation became known as the tradition of the sea. As recently as August of 1874, the crew of the CR Yukon was said to have resorted to cannibalism after their ship went down off the coast of Western Australia. The governor of Singapore had ordered the surviving crew members arrested, and at first, the British government encouraged him to hold a judicial inquiry. However, when it came time to actually prosecuting the men, extended procedural wrangling meant that charges were eventually dropped. This was no accident. During this period, the influence of British Admiralty over their counterparts in government cannot be overstated. Many serving members of Parliament had been officers in Her Majesty's Royal Navy prior to their retirements, so naturally, they had a great deal of sympathy for the survivors of any shipwreck. This didn't mean sailors were free to murder and cannibalize as they pleased, but under the right circumstances, invoking the custom of the sea could prove a powerful defense. The surviving crew members of the Minette knew this all too well. Yet, after relaying their story of survival to the Falmouth customs officer, the deliciously named Mr. Cheeseman, the survivors found themselves standing before a police officer named Sergeant Laverty. They were informed that although they were not being placed under arrest, they were not permitted to leave Falmouth until the situation had been resolved. In the hours that followed, an emergency meeting of the harbor's commissioners yielded the following report. The police have apprehended Thomas Dudley, Ed Stevens, and E. Brooks of the yacht Minette on a charge of killing at sea on the 20th of July last the boy Richard Parker, after being for 18 days at sea with no food or drink. Summonses were also served on 2 seamen of the German bark Monuma as witnesses in the case, being those who cleared the boat of Parker. When news of the macabre story spread around Falmouth, there seemed to be a surprising amount of sympathy for the Minette survivors. When they were officially arrested, a local businessman named John Burton paid a generous amount to bail them out of prison. Even though he had eaten heartily of Parker's butchered flesh, there were deafening cries for clemency when it was heard that Edmund Brooks had refused to take part in the boy's murder. Brooks was acquitted, but despite the controversy, Stevens and Captain Dudley were to be put on trial for murder. Following their transfer to an Exeter courthouse, Stevens and Dudley were found guilty of Richard Parker's murder and condemned to hang. Yet, as one might imagine, the decision was met with outrage from both the Admiralty and the wider British public. Finally, after lengthy and considerable pressure, the death warrants for Stevens and Dudley were torn up and their sentences were reduced to a mere 6 months' imprisonment. The case of the Crown versus Dudley and Stevens is one of the few 19th century criminal procedures still analyzed by law students today. It was also the inspiration for the name of the Bengal tiger in the novel Life of Pi. Some mistakenly believe that the case also inspired Edgar Allan Poe's only complete novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, and it's easy to understand why. Told from the perspective of the anonymous Gordon Pym, it recounts the tale of a perilous sea voyage in which, following a mutiny and monstrous storm, Pym finds himself in charge of the ship's battered remains and accompanied by just 3 others: Augustus Peters and a young cabin boy by the name of Richard Parker. Halfway through the novel, having survived for days on nothing but scraps of turtle meat and drops of fresh water, the desperate survivors are forced to invoke the so-called custom of the sea and begin drawing lots to determine the victim. In the end, it comes down to just Gordon Pym and Richard Parker, and it is Parker who is chosen to be eaten. Yet, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket was not published in the aftermath of the Mignonette sinking. It was published in 1838, a full 46 years before the Mignonette sank and 29 years before Richard Parker, the ill-fated cabin boy, was even conceived. Some suggested this was evidence of Poe's supposed morbid prescience, a symptom of his ever-lingering genius. But perhaps such a coincidence is suggestive of the repetitive and inevitable nature of the event itself. For, since the very first days of humanity's oceanic exploration, accidents and misfortune have humbled even the hardiest of vessels. And so perhaps those who survived disasters involving interstellar starships who ended up stranded on some far-flung shore will once again be faced with what was once referred to as the delicate question. Me, Leonard, and our third friend Jack were going to spend a few unsupervised days at Leonard Beach House in LBI. Jack was a year older than Leonard and me and had recently gotten his license, so we'd be driving down in his car. The drive down was fantastic. Jack was a pretty uncoordinated driver at the time, so most of the ride was spent laughing at him swerving and cursing the road. It was great. We got down to LBI in good time and immediately moved all of our stuff from the car to the rooms we'd be staying in. The layout of the house is important to the story, so I'll briefly mention it. There's a front door, a garage door which connects the back to the front yard, a back sliding door, and a back upstairs deck that connects the upstairs bedrooms. There's also a spiral staircase that allows you to go directly from the back deck to the ground so you can enter and exit the house from upstairs. The house sits along a lagoon, meaning the back end of the house faces a narrow channel of water with houses on the opposite side. We were at that ripe age where chasing girls was a priority, and a nice beach house all to ourselves was the perfect occasion. We spent a few hours figuring out which girls were down the shore at the time and talked to them on Snapchat. Finally, we found a group of 3 cute girls that said they'd be down to come kick back at Leonard House. I had more than enough weed to last us the weekend, and we had snagged a few bottles of our parents' alcohol before leaving. It was perfect. Things were going very well. The 3 girls, Rosie, Alexa, and Sophie, were fun and flirty, and the 3 of us could tell where the night would probably end up. At one point, the 6 of us decided to smoke in Leonard's backyard pool. It was small but perfect for 6 drunk kids. I remember the sight vividly, the gentle bay breeze blowing through my hair, the steam from the heated water rising slowly with the puffs of smoke from the joints. At our age, this was bliss. But then suddenly, Leonard turned the music all the way down and stared over my shoulder into the darkness of the lagoon. Confused, I turned around, peering into the darkness. I could roughly make out the houses on the other side of the lagoon, but I wasn't quite sure what Leonard was looking at. One of the girls asked Leonard why he turned the music down, and he whispered that he saw someone standing on the dock opposite the house. I figured he was messing with us, so I started laughing. "Who cares, bro? People literally live here," I said. Leonard shook his head. "I know that family personally. My parents said they're in Florida for the week." In all honesty, I still thought it wasn't a big deal or he was just messing around, so I kept chuckling. The girls were a little freaked out, though, and said they wanted to go back inside. I wasn't going to argue, so the 6 of us started making our way out of the pool. As we were drying off in the yard, Jack jumped and cursed, looking towards the lagoon. The rest of us turned, and even though the light was dim, I could definitely see what looked like movement coming from the opposite dock. The 6 of us froze in place, trying to get a better glimpse of what we were looking at. Just then, a passing car on the road across from us lit up the scene ever so slightly, and the sight was horrifying. There were 4 tall silhouettes standing at the edge of the dock, facing us. It was impossible to tell what they were wearing or what they looked like, but there was no doubt they were facing our direction. "Go inside now," said Leonard with a shaky voice, motioning us toward the sliding door. As we rushed inside, I heard a distinct sound that remains the most terrifying noise I'd ever heard, for consecutive splashes rang out from behind us. Those guys were swimming across the lagoon. We were in full-on panic mode at that point. The girls screamed while Jack slammed the sliding door shut and locked it. Leonard quickly ran to the front to lock that door too, and the 6 of us ran to a room that wasn't visible from the outside. We waited in silence, horrified at what we might hear next. A few minutes passed, still nothing. Out of nowhere, Jack cursed, revealing to us that he had forgotten to lock the sliding door on the deck. Leonard started to panic, knowing that this house was about to be broken into. Just then, we heard soft, quieted footsteps above us, and that was the last straw. None of us had any weapons on hand, and we were all intoxicated, so running was really our only option. The 6 of us sprinted for the front door and bolted to the car, which Jack started up in a flash. The chaos of it all was too much for Jack to handle, and he destroyed Leonard's mailbox on the way out of the driveway. Once we were far enough away, we called the police. The ordeal was a nightmare. We went back to the house once the police had searched it, but the news was shattering. All the valuables on the top floor were missing, but that wasn't the worst part. Leonard's family owned a medium-sized Boston whaler boat, which was also stolen, most likely as the getaway vehicle. Leonard's father tended to keep a spare set of keys inside a small hatch below the steering wheel, which the police concluded was how the culprits got away so quickly. How they knew where the key was hidden is something I still wonder. The police were never able to arrest the perpetrators and likely never will. Leonard, Jack, and I think whoever robbed the house might have been someone who knew Leonard's family. They knew where the key was and that the house was supposed to be vacant that weekend as well. It's been a long time since this chilling event took place, but I haven't let one day pass without locking every door and window in my home. Do yourself a favor and lock your doors at night. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.